Blessed is the one who subscribes to this channel. Remember the golden rule. Treat others as you want to be treated.
Welcome to Spirituality in Society.
Hey everyone, welcome back. We're diving into something pretty interesting today, how the early Christians viewed their gatherings. You ready for this? The idea of worship services, like we have today, they didn't really exist back then.
It's true, and it's kind of shocking when you first hear that. Our source for this deep dive is a scholar named Tom Wadsworth.
Okay.
He spent like over 45 years researching this. He even wrote his PhD dissertation on it.
Wow.
And he argues that the word worship is surprisingly absent from those early Christian writings
Really?
when they're describing their gatherings.
So if they weren't having worship services, what were they doing?
Well, Wadsworth points to 1 Corinthians 14,
Okay.
where Paul talks about edification all the time.
Right.
Like building each other up.
Yeah.
He tells the Corinthians, let all things be done for edification. So think about how often we just say worship without really thinking about what it meant to them back then.
That's a good point. It's easy to assume it was the same as today.
Right, and Wadsworth really challenges that.
Yeah.
He asks this question. What if God says, wait a minute, people, the assembly is all about you?
Whoa, that's pretty radical. It changes everything about how we think of church.
Yeah, it shifts things from this vertical, God-focused worship to something more horizontal where it's about the community.
Interesting.
Wadsworth calls this the worship anomaly.
Okay.
He says the New Testament talks about gatherings using words like coming together or assembling,
I see.
not worshiping.
So are you saying the word worship isn't even in the New Testament when they talk about getting together?
Not quite. There are 5 Greek words they sometimes translate as worship.
Okay.
But they don't really mean worship like we think of it.
So what did they mean back then?
They were all about stuff they did at temples,
Gotcha.
both Jewish and pagan temples.
Ah, that makes sense. Because Jesus' death basically made all those temple sacrifices and rituals obsolete.
Exactly.
Right.
And Wadsworth really emphasizes that. Think about it. The early church met in homes,
Yeah.
not these big fancy temples.
Right.
It wasn't about doing rituals for God in a sacred space.
Yeah, I can't really picture early Christians with incense and chants in someone's living room.
Right.
It's different from how formal our church services often are.
Definitely. And Wadsworth points out some things that make it hard for us to understand the early church.
Okay.
One is terminology.
Yeah.
Like we use words that aren't in the Bible to talk about biblical things,
I see what you mean.
like worship service. That phrase isn't actually in the Bible.
True. And we can forget that they might have seen things differently back then because we use our modern language.
Another barrier is anachronism.
Okay.
It's putting our own ideas onto their ancient practices.
Right.
We think they must have had something like what we have,
Right.
but that might not be true at all.
It's like we're looking back in time with our 21st century glasses on.
Exactly.
We need to try to see things through their eyes.
And then there's panliturgism. It's a fancy word, but it means we often find all this elaborate liturgy and structure in the New Testament when it might not have been there.
Yeah.
We assume they had set prayers and hymns and rituals,
Yeah.
but there's not a lot of evidence for that in the early church.
So we might be putting our own ideas about church onto the early Christians.
Yeah, it's possible, and it could change how we understand them. Wadsworth also talks about sacralism. It's when we make things overly sacred or ritualistic
Okay.
beyond what the Bible says.
I see.
It's recognizing that not everything has to be super formal and religious. Sometimes the simplest things, like gathering in a home to support each other,
Yeah.
those could be really meaningful.
That's a good point. And speaking of gathering in homes, that brings us to the word church itself.
Right,
At first, it wasn't about a building at all. It was about the people gathering.
that's right.
And that change in meaning has really changed how we understand community and belonging.
Definitely.
Okay, so we've talked about how the early church didn't have worship services like we know them. But what did they actually do when they met up? Makes you wonder how much our ideas of church today are really from the early church.
Yeah, it's like we're looking back, but with our modern ideas blocking our view.
So if they weren't doing something we'd recognize as a worship service, what was the point? What did they actually do in those gatherings?
Well, remember we talked about that word edification? Seems like that was a big focus for them.
Right.
Mutually encouraging each other and building up their faith. Makes sense when you think about it. These early Christians were facing a lot like persecution and social isolation.
Yeah, definitely.
So those gatherings gave them a place to connect and support each other and really grow spiritually.
So instead of a formal service with a sermon and music, they were doing something more like exchanging ideas and experiences.
Exactly. Picture yourself in one of those early house churches.
Okay.
Maybe you'd hear someone sharing how their faith helped them deal with Roman society. Or someone teaching from what they understood of Jesus' words. Maybe even debates as they tried to figure out how to live out their beliefs every day.
Wow, that sounds a lot more interactive and engaging than what we often see in church today.
It does give you a sense of a really active and lively community.
Yeah.
And it goes back to Wadsworth's idea of the gathering being all about you. It wasn't about putting on a show for God.
Right.
It was about coming together to become more like Christ as a community.
It's almost like they saw their faith as something you live out together, not just on your own with God.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. And it reminds us that our faith isn't meant to be lived alone. We need each other to stay strong and keep each other accountable.
We grow together.
Exactly.
This is making me rethink what church is all about. What if we tried to get back to some of that spirit of edification in our gatherings today? What would that look like?
It's a good question. And I think there are a lot of ways we could start bringing that principle into our churches.
Like what?
Well, what if we made more room for open and honest conversations? What if we encouraged people to share their struggles and their victories?
Yeah.
To actually support each other?
I love that. Imagine if our churches were places where people felt safe to be real and vulnerable.
Yeah.
Where they knew they would find genuine connection.
It would be
Transformative.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Think about how that goes back to what Wadsworth said about these gatherings.
Yeah.
It's not about going to church to get something, but to give something back to the community, to build each other up.
I'm seeing how this change from focusing on worship as a performance to edification as something we do together could really change how we understand being the church.
Definitely. And remember, the early church wasn't about being formal and rigid.
Right.
It was flexible. They adapted to what the community needed. They met in homes, public spaces, wherever they could come together to share their faith and support each other.
So maybe it's not about copying exactly what they did, but about getting that same approach, focusing on building each other up and encouraging spiritual growth and having those real connections.
Yeah, that's the key takeaway here. Adapting those basic principles to our own situation and finding ways to express them in our own communities.
It's amazing how much we can learn from those early Christians, even though they lived so differently from us.
It is. And there's so much more to learn about their practices and what they believe.
Yeah, for sure.
But before we go too far down that road, let's recap what we've talked about so far.
Okay, good idea.
Oh.
So we started by talking about how the early church didn't have these worship services like we typically think of.
Yeah.
They didn't use the word worship for their gatherings. And those Greek words, often translated as worship, actually had to do with temple rituals, which Jesus' death basically made obsolete.
Exactly.
Then we talked about edification being a central focus of their meetings. Instead of just listening to a sermon or doing formal rituals, they were really active in helping each other grow spiritually through sharing and teaching and encouraging and supporting each other.
That's right.
And we talked about the importance of understanding the historical context and not letting our modern ideas get in the way when we're studying the early church.
Yeah.
And we started thinking about what all this means for how we gather today. Like how we might shift our focus to edification and create more chances for real connection and support.
It's been a really interesting conversation.
It has.
And there's still more to explore.
Yeah.
It's like we briefly mentioned the way the word church itself changed over time.
Oh yeah, that's a fascinating point.
It connects directly to everything we've been talking about with community and gathering.
Right.
At first, church didn't mean a building or an institution.
Yeah.
It meant the group of believers themselves. It was about the people, not the place.
That's such a crucial difference. It makes you realize how much our understanding of church has changed.
It really has. And that change has really affected how we see ourselves as part of the body of Christ and how we relate to each other.
Yeah.
But before we go too deep into how the word church evolved, let's come back to this idea of edification
Okay.
and think about some practical ways we can apply it to our own lives and communities.
That's a great idea. It's good to talk about these ideas.
Right.
But I'd love to hear how we can actually put them into practice. How can we build a culture of edification in our gatherings and in our relationships with other Christians?
That's a great question. To understand this evolution, we got to go back to the New Testament.
Okay.
The word church comes from the Greek ecclesia,
Okay.
which just meant assembly or gathering. So in the early church, it meant the people themselves,
Gotcha.
the community of believers, not a building.
So from the beginning, it wasn't about the place they met. It was the people coming together.
Exactly. They met in homes, public squares, anywhere they could. The focus was on their faith and supporting each other. But as Christianity spread and things got more organized,
Yeah.
the word church started referring to the buildings where they met.
I can see that. As the church grew, they needed bigger spaces for everyone.
Right. And those buildings became more elaborate and important to community life.
Yeah.
So the word church became more about the actual building.
So church went from meaning the people gathering to meaning the building where they gathered.
Exactly. And that's had some interesting effects.
Yeah.
For one thing, it can make us think of church stuff as separate from normal life.
I see what you mean.
Like we think of church as a place we go to on Sundays,
Yeah.
different from the rest of our week.
Yeah, it's like our faith is only for Sundays and not for the rest of our lives.
Right. But the early church didn't see it like that.
Yeah.
Their faith was part of everything they did. Their homes were their churches, and how they lived every day was how they lived out their beliefs.
Makes you think about how we say going to church.
Yeah,
Like it's something we attend instead of how we live.
it shows how that word church changing has changed our thinking. Early Christians didn't go to church. They were the church wherever they were.
So if we want to get back to that community feeling of the early church,
Yeah.
we need to focus on the people and not the place.
Exactly. It's remembering that the church isn't a building. It's the people, united by their faith and helping each other. That community can be anywhere, not just inside a church building.
This has been amazing. It's made me rethink what I thought about church, and now I see how simple and real those early Christian gatherings were.
I'm glad to hear that. It's good to remember we can learn from those who came before us.
Yeah.
They can show us how to live out our faith better and build communities that are really about love, support, and helping each other grow.
So to wrap up our deep dive into how the early church saw their gatherings,
Yeah.
I want to leave you with this. What if we thought of ourselves not as people who go to church, but as the church itself? Wherever we are, whoever we're with.
It's a great question.
How would that change how we treat each other, how we serve our communities, how we live out our faith in the world?
That's something to think about. And remember, learning and growing and finding new ways to connect with God and each other is what faith is all about.
Yeah.
Keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep looking for truth.
Blessed is the one who subscribes to this channel. Remember the golden rule: treat others as you want to be treated.